And we are live.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this panel, which is titled Putting the Pieces in Place During the Pandemic, a focus on students with autism. I'm Representative Jessica Benham, thrilled to be representing Pennsylvania's 36th district in the State House. And I'm honored to be helping Representative Miller by working to moderate a few of the sessions yesterday and today. Just a quick few announcements, a reminder that we do not, unfortunately, have continuing education credits. And as questions come up that you have for our incredible speakers today, be sure to put those in the Q&A so that we can address them during our Q&A time at the end of this session. I'm going to introduce our speakers for this panel now. So we have Lori Sutton, who's the Director of Special Education for the Bethel Park School District. Lori earned her Bachelor's of Science in Special Education with dual certification in special and elementary education to Kean University, and her MSCD in school psychology with a supervisor of special education certification from the University of Pittsburgh. She has additional certifications in English K-12 and English as a special language program specialist. We also have Dr. Heather Doyle, who has served as the Director of Special Education at Mount Lebanon School District since May 2018. Heather has published articles and book chapters on relational aggression, social and emotional learning, and educational testing. She's also worked on grant projects focusing on expanding post-secondary transition services for students and promotion of healthy eating and exercise, as well as the Ohio Dyslexia Pilot Project. And we have Lou Randall with us as well, who's been the Executive Director of the Autism Connection FPA since 2010. Currently, she's a member of the Information Sharing and Advisory Committee for the Office of Developmental Programs, is on the Residential Provider Oversight Subcommittee, and was appointed to the Victim Services Advisory Committee of the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency in 2018. Since 2002, she's provided professional development training in autism and related disorders for schools, police departments, families, autistic adults, and hospital personnel. And with that, I will turn it over to you all. I'm looking forward to learning.
Thank you so much, Representative Benham. We're really honored to be a part of this year's virtual summit. And our title of our session, the Putting the Pieces Together in Place During the Pandemic, was our kind of attempt at a fun tongue twister for you all. So anyway, joking aside, welcome to our session. And I'm Lori Sutton with Bethel Park School District. And I'll just do a quick overview so we could start the slideshow here. A quick overview on, what we will be covering and what each of us will be presenting. So first of all, too, we want to acknowledge that, our audience may be on various levels. Many attendees could certainly present with us on this topic. We realize that, and other attendees may be new to supporting students with autism. So we hope to present some relevant information for everyone. So we can advance a couple slides. Here's our contact information, which we also have at the end for you. So our agenda today is, first we're going to have Lou Randall talking about some of the characteristics associated with autism and perspectives from the voices of individuals from a recent survey that was administered by Autism Connection, with some pretty interesting and exciting perspectives and results from that to share. And then we'll move in with Dr. Heather Doyle sharing some of the strategies to support students with autism from the research and evidence-based strategies. And then we'll conclude with lessons learned and obviously the Q&A segment. So Lou, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Lori. Thanks, Heather, for getting together today for this session, and thanks to Rep Benham for introducing us, and Dan Miller for having the entire presentation. So today we're going to talk about a little bit about identifying characteristics that are associated with autism, and then like Lori said, we're going to talk about some people's sort of reactions to the pandemic. So we can go to the next slide. Thanks. So I took these autism characteristics, and I do work with autistic people who help me to do a better job with my presentations. So we kind of translated this from the DSM-5. So DSM-5 is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the 5th edition. It can read very like pathological, so we kind of wanted to make this a little more easy to work with and more honestly pleasant and kind of more relatable. So behavior, in case you're new to the autism world, you might notice some repetitive movements, some echolalia, which is repeating what other people say, or maybe repeating some video or some commercial type of things. I did meet a woman once who's autistic that said she echoes some language so she can put it back in her own ear, so she kind of can reprocess that. So a lot of things that we talk about with autism are functional. They just might look different to people that are not autistic. Some insistence on sameness can happen for some people, some patterns of nonverbal or verbal behavior, difficulty with transitions, which again, a lot of these things anybody can have, but these tend to be clustered together as characteristics of people who have autism. There may be a need for routine. I'm going to say may, because the autism is a spectrum. So you'll have some people that don't neatly fit into any category, but generally you might have students who have a need for routine. Very strong interests are a characteristic. These can get stuck in someone's head, which is great if it's astrophysics and that becomes your job. It can be difficult if it's a fear or an anxiety. And just to note that some autistic people do tend to get more things like post-traumatic stress disorder, because fears or traumatic things can get really recycled in thoughts and kind of get stuck in our minds kind of in a difficult way. Sometimes people with autism might have a hard time changing the subject. And again, can have a really intense focus, which could be great for vocations or hobbies. So these things are just characteristics. They're not really something to judge positive or negative. A high or low sensitivity sensory input is fairly common. People might experience pain or discomfort easily, or their brain, because it has extra nerve cells in the sensory systems, might experience numbness or some kind of sensory confusion. So that's just something to be aware of in case you have students or kids at your house or yourself, if you're autistic, that might miss injuries or discomfort like an ear infection, not be able to tell you. So when we have little people sometimes that run into walls and like playing around, and they're really hard wrestlers that like a lot of sensory input and don't seem to feel pain, that's somebody we might not keep an eye on for like injuries or illnesses possibly. So the next slide would be great. Communication differences, we might see less back and forth chatting. We might have people that have a lot of language and just tend to like want to talk about their things a lot and not always share the airspace, which is something we can work on if you're a speech language person particularly, or a teacher or a parent or a sibling. Might have a harder time responding to conversation. I'm going to say in the time that we generally expect. So that's kind of on us as the adults in the room to sort of like manage our expectations and help people have time to process. People might have a hard time initiating and asking for help. So sometimes we see people kind of hovering around and looking maybe expectantly, and we might need to ask them. We might need to initiate if there are our students. Nonverbal communication might be a little bit less coordinated. Eye contact may be different or not made at all. So I always like to say that if someone you're working with is autistic, that they might be listening with their ears. So their ear might be pointed towards you, and them gazing away is not a sign of them ignoring us. It's a sign that they're trying to listen harder with their ear. So just being aware of our own cultural expectations, if we're non-autistic people, to make sure that we're being sensitive and aware of the other person's culture and their pacing and their needs. People, when they have language, because I think know the most that not everybody with autism has spoken language. It might be different in tone or pacing. It might be not possible, especially under stress. I have friends that work that might kind of run out of words at the end of the day if they've been talking a lot, or if they're stressed out or excited. So talking is just different, if it can happen at all. And relationships may be difficult to maintain. I would say more in children sometimes because of changing grades and moving around. I think most of my autistic adult friends and colleagues have friendships and they're married, and different relationships are maintained. But shifting communication across settings, class to class, scouts to home to neighborhood to school bus could be difficult, and friends might come and go. And then people might need help processing and understanding abstract ideas. So to me, that's very much on the speaker or the teacher, or therapist, or whomever, to really be clear in our communication and be ready for people to ask a question and make it a really logical question. So if we've said something that was abstract, that's on us to kind of clear up, I think, as we go. So the next slide would be great. Thank you. So we surveyed people because I was really interested in the perspectives of people on the autism spectrum to pandemic, in terms of watching a lot of policies be discussed and watching some trends across community living and schools, because I didn't want people to make assumptions as we move back toward a more open type society and maybe post-pandemic. So I wanted to ask people, how did you feel about staying at home during the pandemic? And we were sure to tell people, this survey is to help non-autistic people understand your perspective. So we had about 82 people answer this survey, and I'll tell you about what they said. So the next slide. Just to make the point, autism spectrum means a spectrum of reactions to pandemic. So I'll show you what these were in a word cloud next. So people said things like they felt less lonely. There was some talking about not going out means I don't get to see other people who have lots of friends, and I would feel different because I don't have that many friends. So this idea of being okay in their house and less lonely was verbalized that way. Some people felt happy about being home. Some people felt safe, and an equal amount of people felt trapped. So I think this mirrors the rest of society, but I wanted to make that point that, our reactions are all individual. Some people felt less isolated. Again, this idea of not being out in a big crowd where you might feel alone if you only have one friend and they're not even there, perhaps. So they felt like more comfortable not comparing themselves to other people in those situations. Some people felt lonely. There was a lot of freedom expressed in being home and just being yourself and keeping their own sleep schedule and having choices, that are just more individualized and capable or possible at home. Some people said they felt the same. So there's that. There was a couple of people who talked about being stuck with people they're not that comfortable with in their house. There was, related to that, somebody said, I'm skipping down a couple here, stuck with people with negative energy. Fearful, relieved, stressed, comparing myself less again. Someone expressed a love of peace and quiet. And then pretty equally, people said, I miss my friends. So there's some of the expressions that came out in that. And then I picked out a couple of quotes I liked that were interesting. The pandemic has made it easier to avoid things I don't like and has not changed my social life at all. In some ways, it makes me feel more like everyone else, since most people are also stuck at home without seeing friends. So being stuck at home without seeing friends for some people, generally with disabilities, I've heard, is common for them. And they finally felt like everybody else could understand how they felt in pandemic. Another person said, I feel proud of how handling all of the things. And I think that's a really key concept in any kind of social work, or in my background in learning about disability and rehabilitation, because across the disability spectrum, some people can be really, really proud and happy that if they've lost in a different disability realm, the control of the left side of their body, and they've learned how to adapt and be really creative and handle it. So some people with disabilities are proud and happy. And I think that goes against the stigma or the stereotype of everybody with a disability is, bummed out and sad. That's a very ableist kind of attitude that other people could have. So in this context, I'm feeling proud of how they're handling all the things related to the pandemic. This next person said, I live with my parent and constant news television. Many reporters have irritating voices and pressured speech. Just noise from the TV drives me nuts. That's just not something I thought about myself, but I totally relate to that. I could imagine how that would feel. And the last person on this list I picked out said, I've been managing pretty well, although I understand the need for physical distancing. I miss being right next to people. And I thought that was also a nice comment because there's a lot of autism kind of like stereotypes. And I think that that person sharing that with us helps us remember that there's a huge range of reactions to pandemic, and there'll be a lot of range of people coming out of that, so that we can hopefully open our eyes in terms of accommodations and flexibility moving forward and back into school. So now I'm going to pass this off to Heather, and there you go.
All right. So what we're going to focus on now for the next few slides are some evidence-based strategies to support students with autism. And these are considered to be, when we speak about evidence-based strategies or evidence-based practices, what that means is that it's a practice procedure or a set of procedures. It's something that has been shown by researchers to produce positive outcomes for children, youth, or adults with ASD. Now, the title of this slide refers to students because that's who I'm thinking about when with these strategies, in terms of implementing these strategies. The strategies listed on the next few slides focus on some of the evidence-based practices that have been identified by the National Clearinghouse on Autism Evidence and Practice, the NCAEP. There's a reference site at the end of the presentation that provides a link to that report, and also the Professional Development Center for Autism. So when we look through these strategies, something that I want you all to keep in mind is just how these, when I think about these things, I think about them in terms of what they look like in person, when we are face to face in the same space as other individuals, as our students. But this shift we had to make in response to the pandemic and school closures was moving to remote learning and not being with our students, not being in the same place as them. So as we go through these, I will try to bring up how we had to make adjustments to provide these strategies and supports to our students. The first one listed here is antecedent-based interventions. Really, when we look at antecedent-based interventions, it's focused on prevention and looking at the environment. What we typically do in schools when we're creating behavior interventions, positive behavior intervention plans for students, we collect data on the behavior of concern or the unexpected behavior. And then we look at what is happening before that behavior or the setting events. We determine, we record what class the behavior is taking place in, what time of day, what day of the week, who the teachers are, what activity they're doing. Those are all also where the student's seated, all of those kinds of things. And that's just a sampling of the information we look at. But we look at all that information so that we can see if there's a pattern of behavior that's occurring, and if there's something, there's also a pattern in terms of what's occurring prior to that behavior, or something in the environment that's having an impact on the behavior. So if we find that every Monday a student comes in and they are engaging in verbal off-task behavior where they just aren't focusing on school, and they're also saying things that are resulting in other students losing their focus, we might want to look at what's happening, like, why is it happening every Monday? Is there something happening over the weekend that might be influencing this behavior? Or is there something different about how school starts on Monday that is having an impact on the behavior? So that's just an example of what we look at with antecedent-based interventions. also, if we have if we have a student who they spend all of their time looking out the window, then an easy fix for that is to change their seats. Oftentimes it's not that simple, but those are just some examples of antecedent-based interventions. Choice is another evidence-based strategy that we utilize when we're working with students with autism, and really all students. A lot of these strategies they're evidence-based when working with students with autism, but they're good for everyone. So these are things that are go-tos when we have concerns regarding students and their performance in school. So back to choice. When we're looking at choice, it's a great way to allow students to focus on their special interests, and to also allow them to present information in a way that makes sense for them. Some students if they have to give a verbal presentation, that may provoke a lot of anxiety for them. So it may be better for them to create a video, or even to do a poster, or some other way of showing what they know. Also, when it comes to encouraging compliancy or just work completion, providing students with choice regarding what they want to do first sometimes can help students feel like they have some control over what's happening. And then also it allows them to choose a preferred activity. Now we're providing them with two choices that we want them to do. Like, do you want to complete your math work first or your reading work? They are both things that we want them to do, but they are choosing what they want to do first. So choice is something we use a lot in schools. Now, with choice, when we're looking at a remote instructional model, it may be a bit more challenging to infuse choices like kind of on the fly, so to speak, without a lot of planning. But with a remote model of instruction, depending on what is used, what platform's being used, you can provide students with more independent time and just more choices of how they use their time. Also, like looking at antecedent-based interventions, when we were remote, we have it's difficult to observe and take data regarding behavior through a Zoom class or a Google Meet class, because we only can see so much of the screen. We can't see everything that's happening in a setting. But through communication with families regarding the instructional environment at home, we can helps us to gain some insight as to what may be influencing behavior. Moving on to reinforcement. So reinforcement is it's an evidence-based strategy that really looks at the consequence that happens after the behavior. So it increases the likelihood that behavior will occur. So we want to be providing reinforcement for behaviors that we want to see again. And with differential reinforcement of alternative, incompatible, or other behavior, we're looking at reinforcing the behaviors we want to see and ignoring behaviors we do not want to see. Now, the reinforcement of incompatible behaviors is something that we utilize quite a bit when we're looking to reduce an unexpected behavior or an undesired behavior. For instance, if we have students who are, if they are playing in their desks, or if they are on their phones or doing something with their hands that we don't want them to be doing, what we can reinforce is them having their hands on their desk, or we might say ready hands. Now that's something that we would use for younger students, but we're always looking at, when we're looking at behaviors, those alternative behaviors and incompatible behaviors, reinforcing those can be very helpful for us. Now, looking at reinforcement and how that can be done in relation to remote learning, and with in-person learning, it's much simpler, and most of these are much simpler. But when we're looking at remote instruction, again, we may be relying a lot on information from families, and also just being very creative in terms of documenting that the behavior that we want to see is occurring and communicating that so the reinforcement can be provided. Okay, let's move on to the next slide.
Heather, I was going to share a couple of tie-ins to what Lou had presented with some of the survey data. And one of them was with the choice. And I think you did such a nice job talking about, you know, we want to find out what our students' interests are. And I was thinking back to the one comment Lou shared about the pandemic made it easier to avoid things I don't like. So I think we want to find out, you know, always before we start, you know, teaching, you know, how can we tie in things that students are interested in? And I think that was just a nice fit of some of the survey data. The other one that stuck out to me was the individual that said, I feel proud of how I am handling all of the things. And boy, that's like the best reinforcement of all, you know, is that internal feeling good about yourself. And that we know a lot now in the research about mindset and how mindset really can help us, you know, make more progress and do better. And I just thought that was a really cool response that came out of Lou's survey, and really fits in with what you're presenting, Heather, on those evidence-based practices. Thanks.
Okay, so moving on to modeling and then also video modeling. With modeling, we're providing a visual representation of what students, what is expected of them, or what to expect, and we're demonstrating the expected behavior. This is something that, and then video modeling is really the video presentation of this. I would say that video modeling is something we've used much more now that we are when we were remote. We're actually in Mount Lebanon, where students have the choice to attend 5 days a week, but still that's something, and that's something that we utilize and continue to utilize, because we do have some students who are remote, and we're very fortunate that this pandemic happened at a time when we have so much technology available to us. And some of these things are it's so easy to record and video record things now compared to it was even before the invention of smartphones. I know when I was in school and learning about video modeling, it was really thought it was much more cumbersome, where you had to have a video camera and all of those, and then record it and find some way to get the file to like put it on a DVD. We don't have to do those things anymore. And it's just, all we do is send a link or send it in an email. So that's one blessing that regarding just the timing of things, that we have so much technology available to us now. Naturalistic teaching. This is teaching of behaviors in an environment, utilizing interaction techniques and strategies that really mimic where we want behavior, where the behavior is going to occur. It really helps with generalization of behaviors and just teaching those skills in the place where they're most likely to occur. With remote teaching, we have had more opportunities to work with families to set up naturalistic teaching. And also when it comes to like life skills, we have provided families with materials or with supports in place to just have those students engage in those behaviors and those practices, such as like, I know what we have done with many of our students is our teaching is really done, screen to screen. And then we might have a child demonstrating like sorting silverware or something like that, while their teacher is prompting them to do that. And that's in the home environment where that behavior is more likely to occur and can be more easily generalized. Organization and structure. These are organization being having materials available for activities that are being conducted. Also having the predictability when there's organization and there's a structure to things, students know what to expect. They're also provided with notice of a change in schedule. There are routines that are taught to students, and also students are primed and prepared for the next activity. This is something where, as organized as we try to be, when the schools initially closed, we tried and attempted to have plans in place to prepare for remote instruction. But I will say that the spring of 2020 was a time when we were really putting a structure in place, and it was there were some moments of trial and error, but I will say that eventually we got to a place where there was structure and there was a routine and some sense of predictability. Now, there were many changes that occurred during the spring and then also during the school year. But I think one thing like us administrators have learned over this time is just to always expect change, and those strategies that help to make change more palatable to students and then also to families. With parent implemented intervention, that's something that was in place quite a bit during the remote instruction. And it's also something that is it's a practice where we're providing training to parents to implement strategies and with their students. And also it helps to encourage the generalization of skills and the reinforcement of what's being taught in school. Our teachers and our paraprofessionals, also our related service providers, have had ongoing regular contact with parents to the greatest degree probably ever during the time of school closure, because it absolutely needed to happen. And I think it really helped our parents to see what their students are capable of doing and what supports work the best for them. Another evidence-based strategy is self-management, which is it's teaching individuals to discriminate between what behavior is expected or appropriate and what behavior is unexpected or inappropriate, and to monitor their own and record their own behaviors. And then later on also rewarding themselves for appropriate behavior. This is self-management is one of the strategies that's kind of a go-to for me when I'm looking at wanting to implement some kind of behavior change or behavior modification for students, especially if they're in grades in second grade or up. There's certainly some teaching that's involved of recognizing these behaviors, and we have to make sure that students can recognize and discriminate between expected and unexpected behaviors. But a great way that we can help to get students there is also having their teacher or their paraprofessional monitoring and recording their behaviors. So in comparing the ratings, and so that the student becomes more accurate in terms of just monitoring their behavior. And also when it comes to the monitoring piece, if a lot of times if you're just tracking or monitoring, that in and of itself is an intervention. And the accuracy may not come until later, but still just the fact that a child is tracking their own behavior, it's making a change in their behavior. Moving on to the next slide. There are, so there.
Do you want me to go?
Go ahead.
We just had a couple of examples. Okay, we just had a couple of examples to share. So the first one, and these are clickable links, where this is how I wash my hands. This is one where you'll notice there's also a visual support in front of the sink there by the mirror. And we don't seem to have the audio for this, but the little girl is describing how she does wash her hands. And takes you through the step-by-step process.
Sometimes
I
I like
think
it
you
better
can
with
hear me, correct?
Sometimes I like it better
So-
without the audio so that there's less
Without
sensory
the
stuff
audio.
going on.
Sure. But you could see there were some visual supports too in front of the mirror with the pictures and the word chain. So, this was one on, if you could go back a slide. So this was one where, we're using something related to COVID and we were all getting tired of singing the ABCs, or other, pop stars even had songs that you would sing for the 20 seconds of washing your hands and things like that. Are we okay? And so with the video, self-modeling is something you always want to be positive and never show a student not doing a behavior that's wanted, but always doing the behavior that we want, and then reinforcing that or through video modeling. And these can be applied to any skills or tasks, as Heather was explaining previously. And then one more brief example under self-management strategies, and this falls under mindfulness.
My name is Caitlin Lawler, and I'm a first grade teacher. Here's one of my favorite ways to help kids when they're feeling anxious or overwhelmed. It's called Countdown to Calm, and you can do it anytime, anywhere. Start with a deep breath in and out. Look around you and notice 5 things you can see, 4 things you can feel, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste or want to. I use this exercise when one of my students is having a hard time regulating, or with the whole class to help us settle down. I even use it for myself when I'm feeling stressed. Shifting your focus away from worried thoughts to non-threatening things in your immediate surroundings helps your body stop producing stress hormones and resets your brain. Then you can get back to learning and move on with your day.
If you're not familiar with the Edutopia website, they have a lot of really nice resources on that site. But that's just one example, of many different strategies that you could find under that area of mindfulness. So just helping to self-regulate or, for self-management. It's really, we all need to try to think about being calm with dealing with the pandemic. It's been difficult. There's a lot of information out there too for staff and also of course family members to try and lessen our anxieties and things like that. And the more calm that we are, right, the better we're going to be able to support our students in those kinds of things. So those are just a couple of examples. Back to you, Heather.
All right, thank you. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so the prompting is listed here as an evidence-based strategy, and there are several different types of prompting, different levels of prompting, and it's an act or doing something that reminds or helps the learner to complete the task or demand. Now, we do a lot of prompting in schools in terms of in-person learning. We also have learned to do this remotely. It was a little challenging at first when it came to prompting a student while having an adult prompt a student who's not in the same space as that adult. But what we have done is have the adult chatting with just that student, or having a separate meeting just with that student to provide prompting. That's something that has worked out well. And peer-mediated instruction is teaching peers without disabilities ways of engaging learners with autism in positive and meaningful social interactions. This is a strategy I wanted to include because this is something that is easy to implement when we have all of our students here in school. But when we are looking at students who are all at home, it becomes a little more challenging. It can be done through Zoom, Google Meet, through some remote conferencing means, but that may not have the same impact as the in-person interactions, the in-person learning. Task analysis, so breaking down a larger skill into smaller, more teachable steps. This is something that we do a lot. Sometimes we implement this when it comes to assignments, if we have big assignments, and this is something that's good for everyone, not just individuals with autism. But if we have a large assignment, we break it down into smaller pieces and focus on completing one portion and then the next. And then when we're looking at teaching a skill, such as I remember when I was in school learning about this concept, or when I've been in professional development where we've talked about task analysis, like making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich is all as an example that's used of like how breaking down that skill and how many steps there really are that we just take for granted, that need to be taught to individuals when you're teaching that skill. So let's move on to the next slide.
Just wanted to pop in here real quick to say it's probably, I'm gonna prompt you to think about finishing up here because it's
Okay.
just about time for Q&A.
Here are some, these strategies, there's some descriptions here, and then we also have some examples provided. I know I've talked a lot about inappropriate and unexpected behaviors. The reason why I'm using that language is because many of our students who have special needs and students with autism, they have those special needs that really impact their ability, their judgment when it comes to inappropriate and appropriate behavior. And a lot of times when we're talking about behavior, we're quick to point out like that's inappropriate, but we're not so quick to identify that's appropriate behavior. We tend to use the language of expected versus unexpected behaviors because that puts into focus what we expect and what the expectations are in certain settings, and we can also tie that into it's expected that this behavior is expected, and if you have a tendency to, if you engage in an expected behavior, then it's the reaction from others is more positive versus unexpected behaviors. So that's why I've been using that terminology. On the next slide, you'll see the examples that we have of visual supports. And you can see that the one here is on a post on a fridge, a scheduled post on the fridge. On the next slide, there are some, an example of a social narrative. And the link is here in the presentation and then it's actually on the next slides too. So you can see that this is a social narrative, and there's visuals there as well as telling the story or the event from first person perspective to really emphasize that that perspective taking, what you could expect to experience or feel. That's why it's told from that perspective. So we can go back to the slides and then move on to the next slide. So this is just an overview of how schools adapted during the pandemic. I think trying to figure out how to provide all of students specially designed instruction during the remotely was that really required us to think outside of the box.
All right, we have now unexpectedly gone into our Q&A time here. So I'm gonna have to, just ask us to take some questions at this point because we do have a number of good ones. So I'm sorry to cut you off, but the expected behavior at this point in time is that we go into our Q&A. So to move to some of our questions here, the first one that we had come in was, do these strategies consider the autistic students' reasons for their behaviors? Lou pointed out that we don't have to look at you to listen. So why is looking out the window a bad behavior? And why should we punish students by moving them away?
Well, we had some lessons learned that we didn't get to cover And one of the points there was that all behavior is communication. So what are students trying to tell us through any behavioral challenges that may be present due to COVID? And I think, again, it's that whole piece about, listening to the individual and figuring out, why are they looking out the window? What else is going on in that particular? I think that was just a little example. There may not be anything wrong with looking out the window. You hear a noise and I'm going to turn and I'm going to look out the window. But if you're avoiding all of your work by looking out the window, then you want to dig a little deeper. I hope that answers. I don't know if you have any other responses.
So we have another question here from someone. I found that over-explaining to my autistic child why they should care instead of using temporary tricks has been more effective. Considering that we're logical thinkers, we value reason. So if an autistic person doesn't have a motivation to do something, they're likely to forget it or deprioritize it. As an adult, using positive reinforcement is not sustainable since that requires dependence from somebody or something else, or results in other problems like eating disorders. If I shower, I can get a treat, for example. Do any of you have thoughts on that comment?
I do. I've found, like, working with kids, that something Lori said before is really important. So if I can find whatever would make a young man proud in middle school, whatever he wants to do that he's proud of, that we could put little notes in his locker that he could write. I feel really proud when whatever, and let him write that, let him fill in the blank, put his favorite picture of himself on that. So he's making his own basically reward system, just the same way that then he's moving toward adulthood. I always think about when we're raising kids at all, we're raising 40-year-old people. Like, whatever we want them to do when they're 40, we need to be plugging that in when they're younger. And that can go really young. I mean, the person I'm thinking about was 14, but I'd be really happy to put a little unbreakable mirror up with a 4-year-old that says, I'm proud when whatever it is that he wants to achieve that we agree on. So I like that kind of self-motivation, like, early on.
I think a lot of the time when we think about reinforcement, or when we think about reinforcement, we think about tangible reinforcers. But if we identify and see that and help students to identify what their preferences are or what their motivations are, sometimes we can utilize that information to help us in terms of just making sure that education and a student's school experience is successful. And when it comes to things like tangible reinforcers, we certainly don't want students to be to be reliant on receiving a piece of candy or some kind of little trinket or something in response to a positive behavior. But initially that rate of reinforcement may be high, but then eventually we fade that, and then it just becomes part of their repertoire and a skill that they've learned. But we certainly, there are other things that are reinforcing that aren't. And a lot of times what we look at are spending time with peers, or just like for some students being recognized for good work, having their work on a bulletin board or something like that would be reinforcing.
Excellent. Well, hopefully
I was going to add too, we had another lesson learned bullet that we didn't get to, was check to be sure a strengths-based approach is embedded in all teaching and learning experiences, recognize strengths and presume competence. So that person that shared that question about explaining those whys, I think that's really important, because, why are we doing the things we're doing? It's leading to a purpose. It's leading to learning or being more functional and those kinds of things. And I think having that positive approach that we're both in the survey and in the research that Heather presented is really what we need to be doing.
certainly. I would say that presuming competence is probably something that should be the foundation and the grounding for the entire approach, not just one of the points. We have another question here from someone. Isn't there a big difference between unexpected and inappropriate? And I think that I would add onto that person's question, unexpected or expected by whom? Because as an autistic adult sitting here listening to your discussion, I think that was left out, right? Who are these behaviors expected by? Because they're certainly not expected by other autistic people, because neurotypical people behave in ways that are unexpected to autistic people all the time. And no one seems to expect that you would change your behavior for us. So isn't there kind of a big difference between unexpected and inappropriate, and expected by whom?
Well, I think when we're looking at expected behaviors, it would be when we're looking at expected behaviors, it would be expected by the individuals in that environment. That's typically what we would be considering in terms of behaviors being expected. And in terms with using the terminology inappropriate, I guess it depends on each individual's perspective and the language that's used with students, with individuals, regarding what's inappropriate and what's unexpected. Some behaviors may be considered to be inappropriate and also unexpected in the situation, but that really depends on the perspective of the person.
I think that's a really good point. I'm just noticing a lot of use of passive language. Again, in that last sentence, you said may be considered. Well, by whom? Again, I think is really important. Who's setting those considerations and expectations? I think for anyone who's doing any kind of therapy for neurotypical or neuroatypical kids, it's a really critical question to ask and answer. Glory, did you have anything you
It's
want
really
to add?
important. Thank you. I was just going to add, I think it's really important too and one of our other key points was a collaborative team is critical to student success. I think we really need to hear the voices of the parent, on the IEP team, if we can include the students, ideas, and then, how that fits in with the goals that we want to, have with the school, but really it should be that cross settings approach would then maybe help to set, more, I don't want to necessarily realistic, but functional and, other expectations that'll really help the student go from, meet the child where they are to take them ahead and move forward. What do you think, Lou?
Yeah, I was just thinking about motivation, and I would sometimes work with people, again, I'm back to the middle school people, what is your goal? And if it's to become rich and famous, then that becomes some of my language for them. I respect you. I think you'll become rich and famous if whatever that is, if it's going to help them academically or whatever. And my second thought is I work with people in the justice system. And I think the only time we could use inappropriate, language about inappropriate would be where we're getting to teach about how that's seen outside of the school and how it might be seen in society, and to get somebody into some serious, legal kinds of issues. So to me, I would kind of use that heavier language in that context and teach people, how the world is, because it's very difficult for people with disabilities out there sometimes if they're just having not losing awareness of something that they're doing, and outside of a school building, it's dangerous. So I kind of look at inappropriate equals dangerous in my mind, and I would kind of probably tend toward that if it needed to come up.
You. I think that's one of the things I have appreciated about your work, Lou, is your recognition that so much of this is relative to safety and to establishing who holds what expectations. I think that's really critical, because the expectations that say someone's close friend has are going to be, very different from the expectations that, for example, a police officer has. I think you did a really excellent job clarifying that.
Thanks.
We are at the end of our time here, and I know that there were pupils' questions that we were not able to get to. But I really just want to say I appreciate our panelists for entering into this dialogue today, for answering some of the tough and at times deservedly pointed questions that came from our audience. And I just want to encourage our panelists, to not just survey autistic people and then center non-autistic people, but to survey and then to center autistic people when it comes to the lives that they are living. I've worked with Lou very closely before, so I know she does that. Heather and Lori, I don't know you as well, but that's something that I would encourage our panelists and our viewers to do. And certainly as the only out autistic person in our state legislature is something that I work to ensure our government does every day as well. So that is our panel, everyone, and I will look forward to seeing you all later today.